Good afternoon, I'm Caleb. Today, my colleagues and I will be presenting a settlement to end the war in Ukraine and restore peace in Europe. For nearly a year and a half, Ukrainians and Russians have been at war, a regional power against its neighbor. One is defending its sovereignty, the other wants to go back to a time where the two countries operated as one union. This has been one of the most brutal conflicts in Europe since World War II. The total number of military casualties is estimated to be up to 354,000, according to internal estimates, which does not include the nearly 10,000 Ukrainian civilian deaths reported by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Office. Millions more Ukrainians have been displaced within and outside Ukraine. This war has disrupted the peace that Europe and the Western Alliance has come to accept as the status quo, and brought on escalatory risks that can be avoided. Therefore, the United States has a pressing interest to negotiate a settlement where peace is restored and the fighting, which has caused all of these casualties, stops. We do not want more human lives to be taken by this brutal war. However, were this war to continue, our biggest concern is escalation. The last thing we want is for Russia to use weapons of mass destruction or engage NATO troops on the ground against Russian soldiers. Given the recent attack by the Wagner Group, internal division forces Putin to prioritize between keeping troops at home to defend from resistance or sending them to Ukraine. The pressure Putin would face would be immense, and he could well resort to WMDs, including biochemical and nuclear weapons, to take out Ukraine while dealing with domestic resistance. The threat of nuclear weapons is very real. This would quickly turn into a conflict where many more human lives, not just Ukrainians, would be at stake. The settlement we are proposing would avoid the possibility of drastic Russian escalatory action, to which we would have to make a hard choice that presents no peaceful solution. Furthermore, this war has caused a refugee crisis. As of mid-June, according to the United Nations, nearly 6 million Ukrainians have fled their homes and crossed into neighboring countries, the most going to Poland and Germany. Western Europe is wealthy and may be able to foot the bill, but the logistical challenges and political implications of supporting Ukrainian refugees are difficult to contend with. European asylum centers are overcrowded and chaotic. Refugee migration is also a threat to the Western security system because some far-right leaders in Europe could run on platforms of anti-migration. We do not want to risk political fallout in Europe, as this could bring a slew of new problems. The continent is doing its best to manage the refugee situation, but it is not a sustainable, long-term solution. The war also plunged Europe and the wider world into disarray due to sharply reduced gas supply from Russia. When we imposed sanctions against Russian natural resources, energy prices soared. Although these concerns have passed, gas prices could rise again, which is something we want to prevent. Finally, US relations with Russia have been at their lowest since the height of the Cold War. Western businesses have pulled out of the country, fracturing the global economic alliance that Europe and the US tried to build with Russia. With this settlement, we hope to, in the long term, repair and rebuild relations with Russia because it's a regional power, and having it on our side minimizes the risk of conflict. As outlined in the National Security Strategy, the US will sustain and develop pragmatic modes of interaction to handle issues on which dealing with Russia can be mutually beneficial. Proponents of further US involvement want to frame this conflict as one of democracy versus illiberalism and good versus evil. The causes of the war are not as black and white, and part of it is that this war is really about regional power politics, including Russian fears of NATO overreach. We acknowledge that Putin and the Kremlin have committed horrible war crimes, violated international treaties, and adopted violent revisionist rhetoric to justify their actions in Ukraine. They should not be absolved of what they have done. But Russia feels that its sphere of influence has been encroached upon, and we have to propose a settlement that does, to some extent, recognize their concerns. In order to achieve regional stability, it is imperative that Russia comes to the negotiating table. We believe that our policies provide incentives for Putin to end his war in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have fought admirably while being vastly outnumbered, and President Volodymyr Zelensky has served as a beacon of hope for Ukrainians and the international community. Some might argue that Ukraine deserves everything it asks for. With our proposed settlement, however, Ukraine will not get everything at once. That is simply not feasible. Ukraine asks for $750 billion in reconstruction aid, justice against Russian war crimes, all of its territory back, including Crimea, and NATO membership, among other things. This does not favor US interests, especially because some of these demands still risk escalation, which, as I outlined before, would be catastrophic. Even though we will not give Ukraine everything it wants, we would like to emphasize that our policies provide Ukraine with long-term economic and military incentives for coming to the negotiating table. Some might argue that Ukraine should keep confronting Russia. After all, recent developments suggest internal division within the Russian political establishment, as support for Putin has eroded among some members. The rationale is that Ukraine should keep pushing and take advantage of this during its counteroffensive. We think, however, that Ukraine will make minimal territorial gains during its counteroffensive, as per our best internal military and security estimates. We also think that were Ukraine to engage further, the risk of escalation will continue to heighten. We strongly believe that this is not the path forward, and that even though there is internal division in Russia, we should consider a plan that leads to peace. A peaceful settlement would save lives and keep the United States' interest at the forefront of our international strategy, while also providing meaningful economic incentives and ensuring long-term military support for Ukraine. We will outline what military support we are providing right now, when we aim to begin negotiations, and what a 10-year plan consists of for all parties involved. We plan to negotiate as the counteroffensive comes to a stalemate, which is projected in winter 2023, because both armies' positions will be static. We also feel some urgency to strike a long-term deal with Ukraine for Ukraine's security and stability, as US domestic support for the country threatens to wane. Regarding the details of our policies, Sam will introduce the political aspects and their implications within Russia and Ukraine. Then Haley will continue with the international outlines of the deal, including Ukraine's pathways to EU membership, financial details of reconstruction aid, and our plan for Russian sanctions. Finally, Sally will finish with US military commitments to Ukraine, including data on current financial commitments and the implementation of a porcupine model as a long-term solution. I am now going to turn it over to my colleague, Sam.
My name is Sam, and I'm going to go through some of the political terms of our settlement. The first prong of our settlement is a border renegotiation. As Kayla mentioned, Ukraine is currently launching a fierce counteroffensive against Russian troops in the region. This counteroffensive is taking place along this current front line. Currently, Russia holds extreme control over the peninsula of Crimea, as well as many areas in the eastern part of Ukraine, known as the Donbas. Accepted intelligence informs us that this counteroffensive is likely to reach a stalemate in the next few months, likely by winter 2023. This is due to a myriad of factors, including poor weather in the wintertime, as well as Russia being deeply entrenched in the area that it's occupying, which is in and of itself an easy area to defend. We anticipate that neither side, neither Russia nor Ukraine, will make significant territorial advancements without significant military and technological advancements. And this means that once this settlement is reached, both sides will have a different perspective on this conflict, and we can start negotiating for an immediate ceasefire and a political settlement. The first prong of this political settlement will deal with these borders. We anticipate that this political settlement will draw the borders where they lie at the time of their settlement, which will likely look not too different from what we have up here. This would include Russia holding control over the peninsula of Crimea, as well as any parts of the Donbas that it's currently occupying. In return, Ukraine would retain sovereignty over nearly everything else. An important addendum to this territorial renegotiation is negotiating the displacement of people within the region. Since the invasion of Russia, nearly 13 million Ukrainians, up to a third of the Ukrainian population, has been displaced, many of them within Ukraine. If we don't want this crisis to expand even further, we need to think about the people that will be caught in this territorial renegotiation. Many conflicting identities lie in the Donbas. Some people identify as Russian, many identify as Ukrainian, and most are some sort of combination of both. We propose that both countries, both Russia and Ukraine, agree to provide security for people who are looking to move between these regions according to their identity. If we can do this, we will satisfy both sides, as well as avoiding another refugee crisis caused by the displacement of people with conflicting identities. Another important part of our political settlement is the reconstruction of Ukraine. As you can see in this graph, the invasion of Ukraine has crippled the Ukrainian economy. Entire Ukrainian cities have been reduced to rubble, and infrastructure in Ukraine is simply out of the question right now. The World Bank estimates that in order to rebuild past this invasion, Ukraine needs at least $411 billion over the course of the next 10 years. My colleague Haley will go into more detail about where this money is coming from, but it's important that Ukraine get it. This reconstruction aid will have a significant impact in rebuilding Ukrainian infrastructure and manufacturing, as well as offsetting the loss of any territory that was important to the economy before the invasion. If we can do this, it will help rebuild Ukraine and make it more self-sufficient against Russia in the years to come, as well as making it more poised to take advantage of economic growth in the long term. An important addendum to this reconstruction aid is Ukrainian accession into the EU. As Haley will elaborate, we decided not to include Ukraine in NATO, but rather to include it in the European Union. This will have a myriad of effects, but what's important to note is that because Ukraine has such a close agreement with so many countries in the European Union, trade between Ukraine and European Union countries is unlikely to be affected to a great amount. However, two critical economic factors for Ukrainian development will be increased substantially. These include foreign investment as well as the migration of workers. With Ukrainian accession into the EU, it will be far easier for wealthier Western countries in the EU, like France and Germany, to invest in Ukraine. This, along with the reconstruction aid that I mentioned before, will help position Ukraine such that it can be poised for economic growth beyond rebuilding its infrastructure. If we can make Ukraine self-sufficient and independent enough such that it can rival Russia economically, it will feel more secure in its own sovereignty. Additionally, an open borders policy within the European Union countries will make it easier for workers to migrate back into Ukraine. Since the start of the invasion, workers, both skilled and unskilled, have been moving out of Ukraine at record amounts. This brain drain phenomenon is helping drive Ukraine even further into the ground, along with its lack of infrastructure. If we can help emphasize labor workers moving back into Ukraine as it's being reconstructed, it will help Ukraine fortify its economic abilities, as well as helping Ukraine position itself for economic growth. And finally, stringent EU criteria require that Ukraine alter its governmental and economic policy to match the liberal ideals of European Union countries. As far as Ukrainian reconstruction, this would mean that Ukraine would have to adopt important economic reforms, including things like combating corruption, in order to position itself for economic growth. This means that the Ukrainian economy will be more streamlined and, in conjunction with Ukrainian governmental reform, will be poised to take advantage of this economic growth and make it into a truly developed economy. Now I'm going to turn it over to Haley, who's going to talk about the international implications of this political settlement.
I'm Haley. Sam has outlined our plan. Now I'm going to talk about our rationale and what that means on the world stage. First off, a case against NATO membership for Ukraine. In a perfect world, Ukraine would join NATO. It seems fair, it seems just, it's what the Ukrainian people want. We believe that that's simply untenable for a long-term peace in Europe. One of the contributing factors of this war was NATO expansion towards Putin's borders, and we believe that to maintain long-term stability in Ukraine and stop the loss of life of this war, Ukraine can't join NATO right now. Also, putting Ukraine in NATO has the potential to draw the United States into a future conflict. Were Russia to invade again, the United States would have an obligation to join that conflict, diverting resources from other important regions, such as the Indo-Pacific, as we've spent the last several hours discussing. Putting Ukraine in NATO increases the tensions rather than decreases them, which is our primary aim. However, a viable alternative is EU membership for Ukraine. As Sam has outlined, this is a popular policy domestically in Ukraine. It's a morale booster, it's an economic boon to their reconstruction, and it's further integration into Europe and the West, which has shades of the symbolic victory that Ukrainians wanted in EU membership. It's also less threatening to Putin as a primarily economic alliance, and it includes no United States security guarantee. We also believe that this is very feasible. All 27 EU countries have signaled their support for the country's accession into the EU, and, as we'll outline, there's a couple different paths for Ukraine to actually join the alliance. First is a fast-track acceptance process, where Ukraine meets the stringent criteria required for reform, which would take about 10 years, even on a fast track. The country's already achieved candidate status. Now it has to work towards full accession into the alliance. The other is something proposed by Emmanuel Macron of France, which is an associate status, where there's multiple levels of EU membership, moving from the binary of you're in or you're out to an associate status that Ukraine could take on for integration into the alliance as it works towards the criteria for full membership. What we mean to underscore here is simply that Ukraine's accession into the EU is very possible and very plausible and a productive way forward as we negotiate this settlement. Now let's talk about sanctions. We propose keeping many of the sanctions on Russia. Technology and military sanctions will remain. Those are a normal part of great power politics. It's very reasonable for the United States to sanction a competitor on its tech and military exchange, and our sanctions on, for example, semiconductors have been very successful in cobbling Russian military. We will also keep sanctions on individuals, particularly Russian oligarchs. We believe that these are, again, a very fair way of responding to the conflict and have some measure of the justice that Ukrainians want against individuals. However, we'll keep the door open to change those as Russia is further reintegrated into the international order. We will lift other emergency wartime measures. Russia should be reintegrated into SWIFT. Their international assets should be unfrozen so they can access foreign exchange reserves. We think those are important ways to bring Russia back into the world economy and not reasonable to continue after this period of war. Finally, Ukraine is going to need a lot of money. As Sam said, the World Bank estimates that figure of $411 billion. We believe that the United States should commit to 25% of that over the next 10 years. If you look at this graph here, for the last 2 years, the United States has contributed $10 billion in purely economic aid. This is excluding military aid. We believe that this is a reasonable figure for the United States to continue for the next decade. This is the start. We hope that other countries will match the high standard that the United States will set here and help bring Ukraine to the finish line to rebuild its economy and its infrastructure. Frankly, this is money well spent for the United States as we repudiate a competitor, stabilize an important region, and help the Ukrainian people rebuild their homeland. Now I'm going to hand it back to Sam, who will briefly outline some of the political implications of this.
So we've mentioned some of the terms of this settlement, but we need to think about what's going to bring both parties to the negotiation table. There's not going to be a deal if Russia and Ukraine can't agree to talk to each other. So we have to think first about the Ukrainian political implications. The first carrot that Ukraine is getting is a massive amount of reconstruction aid. As Haley outlined, US and other Western countries will contribute to help fortify Ukraine as an internationally significant economy. Ukraine will be able to rebuild its infrastructure, its manufacturing centers, and its agricultural sector in order to position itself as a world economic power and a hub of economic power in Eastern Europe. Secondly, Ukraine is getting accession into the European Union. Ukrainians have complained that they haven't been included in Western alliances. Ukrainians don't want to be neutral anymore, and while we can't include Ukraine in NATO, we hope that by including Ukraine in the European Union, by including them in a Western alliance that Russia isn't a part of and will never be a part of, Ukrainians will be happy to be part of this Western alliance. And finally, as Sally will elaborate, we anticipate a long-term military partnership between the United States and Ukraine. This will help bolster Ukrainian military objectives in order to help it ensure its own security against a competitor like Russia. Policies like a porcupine model and a demilitarized zone along the Ukrainian border with Russia will mean that Ukraine will feel safe in its position next to Russia, even if it won't be a member of NATO. Secondly, we need to think about the political implications within Russia. The main objective that Putin is trying to get across here is that NATO will no longer expand onto Russia's doorstep. By stemming NATO expansion, by not including Ukraine as a member of the alliance, Russia can feel at ease with its own security. This is one of Putin's main objectives and provides important context for why this war occurred in the first place. Because by including Ukraine in NATO, we, in a way, threaten Russia. Secondly, with a border negotiation with Ukraine, Russia gets to hold onto important territory. Significant territory like Crimea and the Donbass gives Putin something to bring home to his population, saying, hey, at least we achieved something in this invasion. This will mean Putin will be less likely to engage Ukraine in the future because he's already brought something home. And finally, through the lifting of wartime sanctions, Russia will be more integrated into the world economy, more poised for economic growth, helping combat a historic decline that we've seen in the Russian economy. If Russia can be more included in the international economy and in the international community, it might be less likely to pursue illiberal actions in the future. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, a territorial settlement, a political settlement between Russia and Ukraine gives Putin a path out of a war that he is losing. Putin did not accept to be losing this war as much as he has, and it has been a travesty. By giving Putin the easy way out, where he gets to hold on to some territory as well as be further integrated into the international community, it positions itself as an amazing carrot for Putin to bring home to his population and combat internal strife that we've seen. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sally, who's going to talk about some of the military specifics of this settlement.
I'm Sally, and I'll be proposing a porcupine model as the basis for U.S. involvement in shaping the Ukrainian army after the war to prevent repeats of the current conflict. So the idea behind the porcupine model is to deter Russia from attacking again by stocking Ukraine with primarily defensive capabilities, while also having the U.S. back away from both a monetary and foreign policy perspective. The analogy for this name is that porcupines have many sharp quills which only hurt when provoked or touched, meaning that Ukraine would only fight back if Russia were to attack first, which therefore poses no direct threat to Russia. This model is similar to the current situation in Israel and Taiwan, in that both countries are currently receiving aid from the U.S. to bolster their military in order to deter their neighbors from attacking. So as for why now, or rather the end of the counteroffensive, which we expect to be in winter 23, well, first, we expect as such, as Sam said, and as Caleb briefly mentioned, because in the wintertime, the adverse weather conditions make the probability of any substantial military gain quite unlikely, and waiting longer to settle after that would greatly increase the risk of escalation for any one party to receive a resounding victory. As a side note, not investing as much into Ukrainian defense as we propose now will only invite future attacks. In terms of efficacy, we think that this would avoid escalation. For example, I'll elaborate on this further, but we are proposing a demilitarized zone to prevent escalation and disputes, and we would man it in part with UN peacekeeping mission soldiers as a neutral party. This also accommodates any counteroffensive outcome. For example, if there's a stalemate, the deal would be appealing to both sides as an alternative to escalation. If it goes well for Ukraine, this would be quite appealing to Russia, as Sam mentioned, as an alternative for Ukraine soundly defeating them. And if it doesn't turn out so well for Ukraine, this would be a solution to war weariness and a potential depletion of foreign aid. In addition, we do not support giving Ukraine offensive weapons beyond what will be given in the counteroffensive, because this would be construed as provocative by Russia. We think that this model is the best possible option because no direct threat is being posed to Russia, and Ukraine will be able to grow its self-sufficiency in the event of future attacks. To build this defense system, we propose first splitting the budget between land and aircraft, similar to how Russia mans its military. And some examples of major expenses would be tanks, soldiers on reserve, drones and other counter-unmanned air defense systems, and Patriot missile defense systems. However, we do recognize that Ukraine has pretty substantial offensive capabilities, especially by the end of the counteroffensive. For example, they're currently being trained to use F-16s, as well as they have many HIMARS and howitzers. But we do propose that they keep these because of the deep imbalance between the arsenals of Ukraine and Russia. For example, Russia has about 4,000 aircraft, whereas Ukraine only has 300. And this deep imbalance would not yield many results if Ukraine were to go into the offensive. As an enforcement mechanism, we are proposing a demilitarized zone between Russia and Ukraine, modeled off Korea, in that it would be a couple of kilometers wide along the settled border, manned with Russian, Ukrainian, and UN peacekeeping mission soldiers. We are also proposing aid over a 10-year period, and towards the end, we would switch from providing pure weaponry to funding their indigenous defense systems and manufacturers to encourage self-sufficiency while also having the U.S. back away. In terms of cost, as I mentioned, we are proposing a 10-year plan $5 billion a year, totaling $50 billion. In order to get this number, we looked at the fact that the U.S. spends about $5 billion at most on foreign aid recipients, and that the border that will be settled would be roughly 2,000 kilometers. Just to contextualize this number, we spend 3.71 of our GDP, or close to $860 billion a year, on our own defense, whereas this plan would cost less than 0.02% of our annual GDP. As you can see in the chart here, which compares our total annual defense budget to total foreign military aid, adding $5 billion would be mere drops in the bucket and would therefore be a great long-term investment. And to further contextualize this number, Ukraine's 2019 defense budget was $5 billion, so we do think that this is an ample amount to restructure their military spending. Before we reach a military settlement, however, we have to look at the present situation to compare costs and to estimate the outcome in time for negotiations. So far, we spent $46.6 billion on military aid, and we're projected to spend $37.7 more by the end of the year. And even though this number is quite staggering, if we look at it as a percentage of our GDP, as you can see in the chart here, we're only spending 0.37%, whereas countries that are closer to the conflict, like Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, are spending about 1% or more. With this money, we support the U.S.'s current plan, which would be to match what we have already given so far from the beginning of the war to now, to last until the end of the counteroffensive. Examples of major weapons being given are manned portable air defense systems, tank and small arms ammunition, counter-unmanned aircraft systems, unmanned coastal defense vessels, and long-range missile systems. By providing these, the U.S. is ensuring that Ukraine achieves the best possible military outcome before sitting at the negotiation table come winter. Here is Caleb to conclude the presentation.
We have presented to you a viable political settlement for the war in Ukraine. We considered the political, economic, and military factors of our solution, including territorial negotiations, incentivizing Ukraine and Russia to come to the negotiating table, a reconstruction plan, Ukraine's membership into the EU, and long-term military support. We have also provided rough estimates regarding the U.S.'s economic commitments to Ukraine in the short and long term. We understand that this policy comes with some disappointment for the Ukrainians, but this is the only settlement we can propose to ensure peace in Europe and combat the forces that have ruptured the continent and beyond. Furthermore, this settlement provides meaningful economic incentives and military support to ensure Ukrainian long-term prosperity. Our most significant motivation is to prevent an escalation of the conflict, which would not only result in the deaths of thousands more people, but would also endanger the lives of citizens in other countries. To avoid the use of WMDs and engaging NATO troops with Russia, we think this approach is the most feasible. Although Ukraine is not losing this war currently, there has been fighting in the Donbass since 2014 and with only modest success. Furthermore, Ukrainian forces are projected to make minimal advances during the ongoing counteroffensive. This is veering towards a stalemate, meaning this war could carry on for who knows how long. Our financial commitment, a total of approximately $150 billion US, would be relatively minimal to restore peace in Ukraine and Europe. We therefore believe this investment in peace would be worthwhile. Our solution is to resolve this conflict, implement the necessary long-term precautions against Russian aggression, and preserve the peace in Ukraine and Europe so that we can pivot our concerns to other regions deemed a threat to U.S. security, such as the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you, and we will now open it up to questions.
Should I go first?
No, I can go ahead, but if you want to go ahead, if you have one teed up, knock yourself out.
Okay, you go first next time.
Works for me.
So your proposal offers a lot of carrots to both sides. What are the sticks? How do you compel Ukraine to accept a rump country? How do you accept Russia to envision a future in which Western troops are along its border? That's quite a long border, too. Some economic sweeteners might be nice, but it's probably not enough. So what are the sticks?
So we actually think that the economic sweeteners are enough and much more than, what however you categorize it as, because they'll get a ton of foreign investment when they accede to the EU. They also have a guaranteed not a guarantee, they have security for the next 10 years because of us. And we think that these are good incentives for Ukraine to come to the negotiating table. We would approach Ukraine at first and see, we're offering you this solution to peace. You're not going to have any more of your people die, and you should probably take this because it's in your best interest and in our best interest to preserve peace in Europe. And with Russia, I think we take a more pragmatic approach. We talk to Ukraine first, then Russia second, where with Russia, I understand that it's going to be tough to come in contact with them at first and try to start negotiations anyways. But we've done this in the past, and Russia also fears more than anything in our presentation, what we said, is NATO expansion. And we're not expanding NATO, and we're providing incentives for Putin to sort of make some economic gains, show some sort of victory to his people, and sort of de-escalate the whole situation.
Yeah, follow up. I've seen, and maybe you've seen more than I have, but I've seen no indication so far that Ukraine is interested in this settlement. And the prospect of EU membership has long been floated to Ukraine. The prospect of NATO membership is being floated to Ukraine. And both of those...
Now demanded.
Now demanded, and both of those giant carrots are not enough. Right? Every single day, Ukraine is proving that it's willing to pay very high costs to continue to try to fight to get its territory back. So let's just focus on Ukraine for now. Russia, there's other issues, but Ukraine. What if the United States says, here's a very good offer, you're not going to get everything, but you're going to get a lot, and if you don't get serious about negotiation, all of that U.S. aid starts to go away. Why not? Why not include a stick along with carrot?
Honestly, we think that that's implicit in our presentation. That is the implied stick of proposing this deal. And we think that it's a very reasonable one because the United States' interest is in peace in Europe, our security in avoiding escalation, and stopping the death and destruction that this war has brought on.
Why not make it explicit?
It sounds kind of bad.
And we also...
It sounds like a hollow threat the way you've characterized it. You presented an open-ended U.S. commitment on the order of $5+ billion per year, forever. Right? If Korea is your model, this is a forever U.S. commitment.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, what is the implicit? This doesn't seem to be threatening at all.
To make it explicit, at least how we interpret it, would be before proposing this settlement with both parties at the negotiated table would be a huge boon to Russia in this war. If we say Ukraine has no choice but to accept this political settlement, or we will essentially leave Ukraine and let Russia raise them, Russia would have no incentive to sit down to the negotiation table. This has to be something that's done behind the scenes. That seems like something Ukraine is an ally. Ukraine is somebody we would go to with open arms and say, we have this political settlement if they are...
Ukraine's not an ally.
They're certainly more amiable to us than Russia is.
I'll add to that. We want to keep supporting Ukraine through this counteroffensive because we think that it'll be much easier to settle something once the front line has stopped moving. Things are static. Things are no longer dynamic.
Okay.
So I'm going to pull on this thread a little bit further and bring Russia back into the mix. Why is Russia going to agree to this settlement? So far as I can tell, the only thing that's really on offer to them that looks different from what they have now, well, the war might end, but maybe, because the Ukrainians get a vote too. So we have to be able to credibly commit to convince the Ukrainians not to continue to prosecute the war. And that seems like it needs to be something explicit, but let's set that aside. More sticks than the cutting off of small amounts of aid. Russia is, so far as I can tell, not simply interested in Ukraine not being part of NATO, but also not being part of the EU. In fact, some theories have said that the real threat wasn't about NATO membership, it was about EU membership, and more broadly, Ukraine moving into the Western orbit as opposed to the Russian orbit. So this actually doesn't look great for them if there's any logic behind that theory, or there's any there. And why, by the way, wouldn't Russia just wait us out? Because if we're essentially saying we're going to spend a lot of money indefinitely, we're going to set aside, if we don't know the future of the U.S. political outcomes, and maybe we can or can't continue to credibly commit to pour this much money in. But maybe Russia just says, well, we're not willing to negotiate. The battle lines have been static. This has been a war of attrition for some time. In theory, right, this same thing that you were proposing, I heard this being bandied last fall, right? As soon as the Ukraine counteroffensive, round one, where they had some successes, not as many as people predicted, but non-trivial, the Russians will decide to negotiate. They didn't, and neither did the Ukrainians, for that matter. So it sounds like, on paper, your proposal sounds like it makes a lot of sense in terms of the if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. But in terms of the on the ground, convincing people to actually do the deed, it sounds like a whole lot like you've created win sets that nobody's going to be happy with. So either apropos of Josh's comment, we need a whole lot more sticks to re-incentivize people about the threat of failing to buy into this, or I would need to see some bigger, significantly larger carrots or some combination thereof that would persuade each of these parties or both of these parties to buy into this proposed settlement. And I'm not persuaded at present, but tell me why I'm wrong.
Start and then you can go. So, with Russia, regarding Russia, we think that given the recent developments in Russia with Wagner, and also Putin's economy and military sort of, not winning this war, and, we don't know how the populace feels about that. From what we know, they might be supporting him through and through. But there's also internal division, and we do not think that what happened with Wagner is the last time that this could happen in the next 3 or 4 years. He faces a lot of pressure. In that vein, he faces a lot of pressure both internally and externally. And we think that this is a way for him to sort of recoup his losses and reevaluate, what he did. And he's in a very tough spot right now.
There's a reassessment because of what happened last weekend. Is that what you're?
The internal division, we think, is a vital component of the response to your question. And we just think that this is right now a really hard time for him, and we haven't really seen something like this with a Russian leader in quite a while, from what we understand of Russian history. So he's facing immense pressure, and we do not see any reason why he wouldn't take this deal to sort of to just avoid the alternative. And yeah, if you want to add to
It
that,
was
Haley.
right there. The answer was right there in your question. The war will end. That's really big.
I'm sorry?
I said the answer to your
Yeah.
question was right there in your question. You said, the war will end. That's really big to Putin.
Is it? Yeah, that's
I think so.
that's the part I have not seen enough evidence to suggest that we're there yet. And I'm prepared to be persuaded that I'm wrong, but apropos of our discussion last night, it's like, what would be your criteria that would have to be fulfilled for you to say, this is proof that for Putin, the key goal here is to see this war over? Today.
Well, I think that the reason why after counteroffensive number 1 Putin decided to continue and even invade in the first place is that he greatly underestimated Ukraine's capabilities. So I think that Putin originally thought that this would be another 2008 Georgia situation where he walks out 5 days later with basically whatever he wants. And after the first counteroffensive, he tried again with greater capabilities, and then just at a certain point, and we really think that this counteroffensive will show, you can't just keep escalating. And you're going to have to reach a settlement eventually before you ultimately decimate your entire country, your army, your economy.
So this is premised on the idea that it's going to hit a stalemate in December or at the end of this offensive. What if it doesn't? What if there's a breakthrough on one side or the other?
Okay, so let's kind of go through the scenarios. Let's say, war is unpredictable. Ukraine is doing really well in the counteroffensive. It wants to try to take back Crimea, wants to take back the Donbass, maybe even wants to go further than that. Ukraine is operating purely on U.S. support. We would say that it's a normal part of great power politics. We're not going to support an incursion into what we see as where the borders should lie.
And Zelensky's got to sell that to his people that we're pulling the plug, and that's no small task at this point either, given where we've got.
So that's the stick.
It's no small task.
That's the stick.
Right.
As far as Russia, say Russia does really well in the counteroffensive, starts pushing back, support Ukraine some more. Give them some more offensive capabilities until they're able to reach the stalemate.
Okay. Fight to a stalemate. I have a question about the stalemate and the long-term solution. This is kind of a practical problem that you talked about, creating a DMZ on the border of essentially what are the front lines now. What do you do about the Belarusian border? That's where the invasion came from originally, and that's much longer. So do you extend the DMZ all the way around Ukraine's Belarusian border, or do you leave that unguarded?
Well, since we kind of view Belarus as sort of a vassal state, especially with the recent, news articles that are coming out that Russia's beginning to store some of its more of its nuclear arsenal in Belarus, I would say yes. And I recognize that would probably cost a lot more money, and it would, but I think it's worth it.
Okay. This is not a lot more, but this is extraordinary, establishing this kind of line. I mean, Korea is an interesting analogy, but it's a peninsula. It's quite narrow at the middle. It's not like the geography of Ukraine. So if the United States decides to fund a DMZ running along the entirety of the Russian and Belarusian border to Ukraine, that means a huge military presence. And doesn't that
And not just in the DMZ.
Yeah, doesn't that frighten Russia, which is the situation we're trying to avoid?
We would have
Western troops right along its border on a highly fortified long line?
in addition to we were talking about Korea, so the way Korea works is that it has both North Korean and South Korean soldiers along the border to kind of mitigate each other. We do support having Russian and Ukrainian as well as a neutral party along this border in order to effectively cancel out each other.
So I have a kind of political question here. If, for example, President Macron of France put this forward, we would denounce this deal. Now, if Zelensky put forward this deal and said, "Hey, I would be willing to think about this," we would say, "Well, if you're willing to accept it, we would have a different attitude towards it, and we could think about what other players would do." But assuming you guys want to put this forward when the counteroffensive kind of comes to an end and the stalemate is clear. Have you thought about the mechanics of how that happens? Is this a President Biden, speech to the nation? Is this sending envoys, to meet with people in strange locations out of everyone's eye? Are we going to spring this on the Ukrainians and Europeans later? How do you see this going from a concept to a reality?
I can take this one. We wouldn't hold a summit, first off. We think that would just cause provocations. And we also think that it would be a stab in the back to Ukraine if we just suddenly announced something like this. Now, what we would do
What you're not saying, though, by the way, is both public is bad and private's bad.
Right.
So
So what we would do is we would meet with the European. I think we think that the Europeans would be on board with this because they want European security and they want the region to be stable, and they also it benefits them to invest in Ukraine in a long-term investment.
So
But-
real quick,
yeah.
your Western European allies might say that, your Eastern European
Okay.
allies
So
might say
with-
exactly the opposite.
So with Ukraine, we would meet with them in private, not with any, and we would show them the deal and say this is our deal. And in addition to giving them a bunch of carrots, here's the stick. If this is within your interest, and this is within our interest. If you don't take this, we have no reason not to withdraw what we've given you, withdraw whatever we've committed. And that might be very harsh, and they might perceive that as a stab in the back as well. But we think that for the security of the region and to avoid escalation, that is the necessary precaution that we have to take.
Okay. And by the way, I don't necessarily disagree with you. I do think if I'm President Biden running for re-election in 2024, this is going to be a hard sell in lots of ways, because people who are now kind of lukewarm on the Ukrainian commitment will be the first person to call this as a kind of appeasement move and everything else. So it would be very delicate in lots of ways. Not that there's an obvious answer how to get around all that.
Relatedly, are you at all concerned about how our Eastern European NATO allies would view this? If not quite a stab in the back, then maybe calling into question our credibility to their defense, if we're, when push comes to shove, willing to negotiate and reward aggression. So what if the Russians decide they want to bite off a piece of Poland? Just as a for instance.
And by the way, remember, this all goes back to the historical legacy of Yalta, where we supposedly sold out the Eastern Europeans, and we've always vowed we're never doing Yaltas again.
Never again until the next time.
Never get till the next time, which is kind of what you guys are proposing.
Okay, say, Eastern European NATO allies. We're talking about stemming NATO expansion. We're not talking about removing members from NATO. That actually doesn't exist in the NATO charter. If Russia were to invade Poland, that is a NATO country. We have a security guarantee with them. We totally support pushing back against Russia. That would be an extremely sharp escalation from Putin to do that. And Putin knows that.
Well, and so do they, but rhetorically, I mean, would they get a whole lot? They would, arguably, they would still feel insecure. They would certainly say this makes them feel insecure. This is about the politics.
By the way, Poland's reaction to this whole thing isn't, well, who cares what goes on in Ukraine because we're in NATO and it doesn't bother us. They clearly think this has lots of implications for their basic security. So.
Can I ask a question? Someone looking at this war might say this was an unprovoked invasion, naked aggression launched by a U.S. adversary led by someone who has repeatedly tried to harm U.S. interests. This is an opportunity to send message to our allies, and the policy has been remarkably successful to this point, so much so that we are now seeing internal dissension within Russia. So if you're not going to take a hard line in this instance when it seems to be working so well, when would you want to take that sort of policy?
The hard line policy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Our biggest concern is that even though that there has been so much success on our, for the Western countries, if you want to call it, and Ukraine, we want to avoid escalation. And we've seen that for the past year and a half, as this war has gone on longer, the chances of escalation are higher. And also division in Russia contributes to that, and that could very well lead to something much more catastrophic than we could imagine.
What's the evidence that the risk of escalation is now higher?
Well, Putin has threatened multiple times to sort of risk escalation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it's also a risk we don't want to take. And Putin has faced more in the past year and a half than most Russian leaders have faced in their entire terms. He's faced internal division in a year and a half, as well as losing a war in Ukraine and devastating his economy. And he's lost some support among his populace. Not everyone, but there are documentaries about that. And there are some documents about that. But so we think that this is as dangerous of a time as ever in Russian history, where they could very well not bluff the escalation, but actually take escalation. Make escalation happen and use WMDs to sort of, I guess, not completely destroy themselves. So that's our reasoning for why we think escalation is a threat. This is a horrible moment in Russian history, and it's a very dangerous moment. Probably some of the worst things they faced in a century. So we don't see why escalation isn't something that they would resort to, and we also don't want to risk that, given how historically momentous this moment is for the Russians.
There is a bit of a tension in your argument, because on one hand, you're saying they're desperate for a way out, but also they're as keen as they ever were to escalate. So not say one can't formulate a scenario whereby you get to both of these things simultaneously, but it requires a very particular set of circumstances whereby they're as willing to go bigger or to escalate this conflict as they ever were, at the same time as he's desperate for an off-ramp, and we just need to give him far less than he said he was willing to take before in order to get out. So just keep that in mind in terms of thinking about.
There's another.
Go ahead.
I mean, there's another tension as well, which is that your whole argument is premised on the idea that there's going to be a stalemate, that this is going to be a deep and
A hurting stalemate.
A hurting stalemate, but it's going to be a deep stalemate. Why in the world would Russia use nuclear weapons if it wasn't at risk of rapid failure, if it was actually in a condition of stalemate?
Just keep on keeping on.
Keep on keeping on.
There are other levels to escalation besides World War III. Even putting one more troop on the ground is technically escalation. They could raise the draft age. I think they're already trying to raise it from 27 to 30. They could use more aircraft. And with the stalemate situation, if you escalate in little steps like that, Ukraine and its allies are probably just going to respond with similar steps. So it just keeps on building and building and building. And I think finding a way out for both parties would be something that they would both be interested in.
How are we time-wise?
We got enough time for another question if you've got one.
Of course I do, but.
I want to know
Yeah.
how this helps U.S. brand strategically over the long term. The United States has already...
Even in the short term.
In both.
Yeah.
I mean, the United States we've already brought in 2 NATO members, which is going to increase U.S. security implications. And we will be implicated in a larger European security project. And you're talking about what I think are actually quite conservative reconstruction estimates about how much the U.S. will actually foot the bill here, and notwithstanding the DMZ, which is going to be quite costly as well. What's left for Asia? What's left for dealing with the incredible mounting debt crisis in the global south, which we're going to have to face at some point? What's left for climate change, which is going to be a big price tag as well? Is this financial wishful thinking, or is this just our priority and we're willing to sacrifice other grand strategic goals?
I think that for now, what we're trying to do, our priority right now is to avoid escalation, that's the theme of our presentation. And yes, we would say that right now we would prioritize putting lots of money, and I don't know how conservative those figures are, but if we looked at, what our GDP is, how much we spend on foreign aid annually in the past decade, we really don't think it would be, and especially considering we have support in Congress right now for funding this war and for, in the future, we don't think that this is something that'll be, a major, cost in the overall picture to the U.S. And I think that we can deal with this conflict as well as other things such as climate change. at the same time.
Also, the alternative to a political settlement is more war in Europe, and the United States pays a lot of money, expends a lot of national attention, so there's a lot of chaos if there's more war in Europe.